Hello, and welcome to Sci-Fi Stories. Our channel was recently demonetized by YouTube, leaving us without the budget to keep the lights on and our team paid. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1, so our creators can pay for their living expenses and continue bringing these adventures to you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or comments below. The universe is a cold and unforgiving void, but nothing compares to the suffocating, neon-lit hierarchy of the Zenith Galactic Academy. Here, the weak are prey, and the strong shine with literal crystalline arrogance. But today, the apex predators of the cosmos are about to learn a brutal lesson about Earth. A lesson delivered not by dreadnoughts or laser cannons, but by a mother's packed lunch. Callum Blanco wiped a thick smear of hypergrease from his forehead, leaving a dark streak across his pale skin. At 19 years old, the human student looked like just another invisible, unremarkable speck in the sprawling, shadowy underbelly of the academy. He wore the drab, oil-stained gray jumpsuit of the maintenance crew, a humbling necessity to afford the exorbitant tuition fees of this floating elitist fortress. Most aliens passing by the vents saw nothing but a slacking primate holding a hydrospanner. What they failed to see was an electromechanical genius who mapped the station's labyrinthine neural pathways in his sleep. Zenith was a toxic ecosystem of rigid, inescapable castes, and Callum thrived by being entirely overlooked by the upper echelons. A few yards below Callum's elevated ventilation grate, the main cafeteria was a churning sea of shifting scales, glowing appendages, and grating synthetic chatter. Through the rusty metal grating, his sharp eyes tracked Lyra, 18 years old and brilliant enough to rewrite fundamental astrobiology paradigms. His best friend still moved like a frightened mouse in a pit of vipers. She clutched a battered, absurdly thick quantum alloy insulated lunchbox tightly to her chest. It was a care package from her mother back on Earth, an artifact of maternal love, built with the structural integrity to withstand atmospheric re-entry. Lyra tried to shrink into the deep shadows of a massive hydroponic pillar. But in a school architecturally designed to elevate predators, prey always stood out in stark relief. The ambient temperature in the grand dining hall spiked sharply as the Kalen clique arrived. They were a cluster of towering energy crystal entities, their faceted bodies radiating a harsh, blinding ultraviolet superiority that physically stung the eyes. The Kalen did not walk. They glided over the polished floors with an unbearable arrogance that forced the lesser, flesh and blood students to scatter in sheer panic. They considered themselves the absolute apex of cosmic evolution. Their favorite pastime was enacting arbitrary security confiscations on any species they deemed soft, weak, or simply offensive to their glowing perfection. Nobody dared to intervene or protest. The Academy guards, heavily armed and supposedly impartial, simply looked the other way when the Kalen decided to enforce their own cruel brand of law. The towering crystalline leader of the clique targeted Lyra with the merciless precision of a heat-seeking missile. He cornered her against the damp hydroponic pillar, his jagged, luminescent hand extending in a silent, undeniable demand for the battered metal lunchbox. Lyra trembled violently, her knuckles turning bone-white against the thick quantum alloy casing. But she did not immediately surrender her only connection to home. She looked up at the blinding, faceless entity and spoke with a quiet, heavily practiced politeness. "Please, you do not want this," Lyra said, her voice steady despite her shaking frame. "Your bodies are not configured to absorb the thermal capacity of this item." The Kalen leader emitted a sudden, harsh sound like grinding glass, a mocking alien approximation of a laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He snatched the heavy container from her fragile grip with sudden, violent force. The advanced locking mechanism groaned, sparked, and snapped completely under his raw, overwhelming crystalline strength. Inside the box sat a dense, smoking block of effervescent nitrogel ice cream, an experimental earth snack heavily chilled with liquid nitrogen and deeply infused with extreme cold fermented fungi. It was a bizarre delicacy for humans, but an absolute thermodynamic nightmare for anything lacking an internal furnace. Disregarding the heavy white frost instantly forming on his glowing, superheated fingers, the Kalen leader shoved the entire frozen mass into his luminous maw. He swallowed it in one greedy, triumphant gulp just to assert his absolute dominance over the pathetic primate. Up in the greasy shadows of the maintenance duct, Callum quietly powered down his heavy hydrospanner. He leaned back against the freezing cold metal plating, his dark eyes entirely fixed on the radiant, crystalline bully below. With slow, highly deliberate movements, Callum tapped the glowing interface on his battered wrist console, setting a silent timer for exactly 12 minutes. A dark, jagged smirk crept across his face as he watched the digital numbers begin their countdown toward absolute zero. Exactly 12 minutes passed. Up in the maintenance shafts, the digital numbers on Callum's wrist monitor flashed to zero. Down on the main deck, the towering Kalen leader suddenly froze. The harsh, ultraviolet radiance illuminating his crystalline chest flickered violently, cycling through 6 shades of violet before dimming into a dull, terrifying gray. The extreme cold fermented fungi from the consumed nitrogel had bypassed the entity's rudimentary digestive tract and embedded directly into his energy matrix. Absolute zero met raw plasma. The laws of thermodynamics demanded a violent equalization, and the alien's biology was losing the war. A jagged web of opaque white frost spider-webbed outward from the leader's core, tearing through his internal crystal lattice with a sickening series of sharp, percussive cracks that sounded like shattering tectonic plates. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized the apex predator. His biology, facing sudden and catastrophic core death, triggered a desperate, ancestral survival mechanism. He became a biological black hole. To reignite his dying internal furnace, the Kalen's body began frantically tearing thermal energy from everything within a 50-yard radius. He did not simply emit cold, he devoured heat. The atmospheric temperature in the massive cafeteria did not just drop. It plummeted in a terrifying, sheer cliff dive of physics. The remaining Kalen gang members, attempting to stabilize their leader, were instantly caught in the endothermic vacuum. Their own heat was violently ripped away, turning them into secondary thermal voids. The effects on the grand dining hall were instantaneous and devastating. The ambient humidity of the colossal room flash froze in midair, conjuring a violent, localized blizzard of razor-sharp ice crystals that slashed at exposed skin and scales. High-end synthetic tables and reinforced seating benches violently contracted and exploded into jagged shrapnel due to the immense thermal shock. The air itself grew so thick and agonizingly cold that every breath felt like inhaling powdered glass. For the cold-blooded students, it was a sudden, inescapable apocalypse. Dozens of reptilian and amphibian species, their metabolisms entirely reliant on ambient warmth, experienced immediate catastrophic systemic failure. Without a single cry, they collapsed en masse. Their bodies slammed against the frost-covered flooring as their nervous systems forced them into a violent, non-consensual hibernation, effectively turning them into living statues scattered across the expanding tundra. Deep within the station's armored core, Zenith's central artificial intelligence registered the catastrophic plunge in localized thermal dynamics. Lacking the nuanced programming to identify an Earth snack as the culprit, the system's threat assessment algorithms instantly flagged the massive entropy spike as a targeted thermodynamic weapon attack. The emergency protocols engaged with brutal, mechanical efficiency. Deafening, bone-rattling klaxons tore through the frozen air, their shrieks barely audible over the roaring wind of the indoor blizzard. Blinding red emergency strobes bathed the chaos in a hellish, flickering light. Massive, unyielding bulkheads forged from solid titanium alloy slammed down from the ceilings across every exit, their heavy locking mechanisms engaging with a definitive, booming thud. The lockdown was absolute. The epicenter was sealed to prevent the supposed weapon from spreading its icy contagion to the rest of the orbital station. Absolute pandemonium erupted among the surviving warm-blooded students. Thousands of highly evolved, supposedly civilized extraterrestrial scholars abandoned every shred of their cultured dignity. They shrieked in primal terror, trampling over their fallen cold-blooded classmates in a blind, savage stampede toward the sealed titanium doors. They clawed uselessly at the frosted metal, their desperate cries forming a horrific symphony of despair against the howling artificial winter. It was a terrifying display of biological frailty, a stark reminder that beneath their advanced technology and glowing auras, they were all just fragile prey trapped in a cage of ice. Amidst this swirling vortex of terror and freezing death, a heavy metal grating popped open in the ceiling. Callum Blanco dropped down from his ventilation shaft with casual, practiced ease. His heavy maintenance boots hit the frosted floor with a solid thud. He did not run. He did not scream. Moving with the calm, predatory grace of a species forged in the harshest ice ages of a death world, he walked at a measured pace straight through the center of the panicked mob. The freezing winds whipped at his hair, but his human biology simply adapted, his body aggressively burning calories to maintain its core temperature. He reached the hydroponic pillar where Lyra remained huddled, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. Without a word, Callum stripped off his heavy, insulated maintenance jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders, zipping it up to her chin. He sat down heavily on a shattered, ice-coated bench right beside her. Reaching into the deep pocket of his work pants, he pulled out a small, dented tin of Earth-made ginger biscuits. "Want a biscuit?" Callum asked, his voice entirely devoid of panic, slicing clearly through the ambient chaos. Lyra stared at him, her eyes wide as she pulled the heavy jacket tighter around herself. She nodded slowly, reaching out a trembling hand to take the offered snack. Together, the two humans sat side by side, calmly chewing their biscuits in the dead center of the frozen apocalyptic wasteland, entirely unbothered while the apex predators of the galaxy shattered into ice around them. The heavy titanium bulkheads, sealing the cafeteria, did not slide open quietly. They were violently breached from the outside, the massive locking mechanisms melting under the searing heat of industrial plasma cutters. As the glowing metal gave way, a heavily armed tactical security squad breached the frozen perimeter. They were clad in bulky, heavily insulated thermal hazard suits, their breath hissing through external rebreather tanks. The guards swept their pulse rifles through the artificial blizzard, expecting to find a coordinated terror cell. Instead, they found a graveyard of flash-frozen students and two humans calmly finishing a tin of ginger biscuits. Callum and Lyra were immediately apprehended. There was no physical struggle. Callum merely dusted the cookie crumbs from his maintenance trousers, offered Lyra a reassuring nod, and allowed the trembling guards to slap magnetic cuffs onto his wrists. They were marched out of the freezing catastrophe, escorted through a labyrinth of sterile, high-security corridors, until they reached the nerve center of the Zenith Galactic Academy. The central command deck was a sweeping, circular amphitheater of polished obsidian glass and glowing tactical consoles. Standing at the apex of the room, looking down at them with thinly veiled disgust, was Headmaster Vok. Vok belonged to an avian-reptilian hybrid species, tall and impossibly gaunt, wrapped in the dark, immaculate robes of a career politician. He was a ruthless opportunist, a creature who viewed every tragedy as a stepping stone. More importantly, he belonged to the rival political faction of the Kalan Empire. Without offering a single word of greeting, Vok gestured sharply with a taloned finger toward the massive holographic projector dominating the center of the room. The projection flickered, rendering a highly detailed, three-dimensional biological scan of the entire cafeteria sector. The image was a terrifying diagnostic of microscopic warfare. The scan zoomed in on the Kalan leader's frozen, crystalline core. The extremophile fungi from the Earth ice cream organisms naturally evolved to survive deep-sea freezing, and radioactive vacuums had not simply died upon contact with the Kalan's raw, plasma-based internal energy. They had violently mutated. "Look at this!" Vok hissed, his voice a sharp, grating whisper that carried across the silent command room. "Your primitive sustenance did not just cause a thermal drop. It initiated a parasitic synthesis." The holographic display shifted, highlighting a sprawling, luminescent network of glowing blue tendrils. The mutated extremophile had transformed into a highly aggressive, biocrystalline ice fungus. It was currently using the frozen Kalan bodies as biological batteries, aggressively branching out from their chests and eating its way into the station's intricate electrical grid. The glowing fungal roots were seeking out high-voltage conduits, feeding on the current, and rapidly spreading a localized deep freeze through the station's walls. Vok turned his cold, reptilian eyes onto Callum and Lyra. He steepled his long fingers together, a cruel, calculating smile stretching across his narrow face. "An ingenious biological weapon, I must admit," Vok stated, his tone dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You humans grew tired of the Kalan aristocracy looking down on you. So, you conspired to smuggle a targeted genetic terror agent onto my station. You orchestrated this catastrophe to force my hand, giving me the perfect, undeniable excuse to expel the entire Kalan student body for harboring hazardous anomalies." Lyra gasped, her face draining of what little color it had left. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain that it was just her mother's dessert, but the sheer weight of the accusation paralyzed her vocal cords. Callum did not flinch. He stood entirely relaxed, his posture casually defiant against the austere backdrop of the command deck. He looked at the headmaster, not as an authority figure, but as a mildly annoying mathematical error that needed correcting. "That is a fascinating political fiction, Headmaster," Callum said, his voice smooth, steady, and razor-sharp. "However, it completely ignores the security footage you are conveniently hiding on your secondary monitor. The footage that clearly shows the Kalan initiating an unauthorized physical assault and committing grand larceny against another student." Vok's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "The theft is irrelevant. You brought a weapon of mass destruction into a civilian sector. I brought dairy and fermented mushrooms," Callum countered instantly, stepping forward to close the distance between them. "According to the Zenith Intergalactic Commerce Treaty, Section 4, Paragraph 12, Earth-based culinary items are legally classified as standard biological commodities, fully cleared for transport. Furthermore, under the Academy's own internal security bylaws, Article 77 clearly states that any biological incompatibility resulting from the ingestion of stolen property rests entirely on the perpetrator." Callum leaned slightly over the holographic table, the blue light illuminating his dark, intense eyes. "But let us address the real crime here. Vok, the reason half your student body is currently experiencing hypothermic shock is not because of an ice cream cone. It is because your central artificial intelligence is running on a severely outdated threat assessment matrix. You refused the budget allocation to upgrade the AI's nuanced reasoning protocols 3 months ago. So, when the temperature dropped, your cheap system panicked. It triggered a titanium lockdown instead of a standard medical quarantine, trapping thousands of innocent bystanders in a freezer of your own making." The command deck fell into a suffocating, deathly silence. The bridge officers entirely stopped typing on their consoles, terrified to even breathe. Callum had not just defended himself. He had systematically dismantled Vok's political trap and exposed the headmaster's gross, administrative negligence in front of his entire staff. Vok's face flushed a deep, furious purple. He opened his mouth, preparing to order the immediate execution of the insolent maintenance worker. He never got the chance. A catastrophic, violent tremor tore through the Zenith Academy. The entire command deck pitched sideways, throwing officers aggressively out of their chairs and sending datapads shattering across the obsidian floor. The ambient lighting flickered, died, and was instantly replaced by the blood-red glow of the secondary emergency backups. "Report!" Vox screamed, struggling to maintain his footing against the command console. A bruised navigation officer frantically tapped at a shattered screen. "Headmaster, the fungal root network has reached the primary sub-basement. It just breached the main reactor core. The ice fungus has completely paralyzed the primary energy output. The station's orbital stabilizers have gone entirely offline." The massive holographic projector in the center of the room violently glitched. The biological scan of the cafeteria vanished, replaced immediately by a terrifying, wide-angle orbital telemetry map. The Zenith Academy was no longer holding its stable, geostationary orbit. Without power to the stabilizers, the colossal space station had begun a slow, agonizing drift. Right in its path, glowing ominously on the red telemetry map, was the Tartarus debris field, a lethal, high-velocity asteroid belt notorious for shredding derelict freighters into metallic dust. The station's automated, synthesized voice echoed through the dim command deck, utterly devoid of emotion. "Warning! Catastrophic orbital decay detected. Gravitational pull of Tartarus anomaly engaged. Estimated time until complete structural annihilation, 45 minutes. The red emergency lights above the command deck did not just flicker, they violently died. A heavy, suffocating darkness crashed down over the station, accompanied by the terrifying, high-pitched whine of the life support turbines spinning down into absolute silence. The massive air processors halted completely. Within seconds, the atmosphere grew noticeably thin, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of recycled carbon dioxide and raw, unfiltered fear. Out in the civilian corridors, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and catastrophic. The video feeds on the remaining auxiliary monitors displayed absolute carnage. The highly evolved, supposedly enlightened species of the galaxy completely shattered under the weight of their own mortality. Avians, reptilians, and mammalian hybrids alike devolved into mindless, stampeding herds. They shrieked, clawed, and trampled over their own terrified classmates in a futile, illogical rush toward escape pods that were already locked down by the central computer. Their advanced cortical brains were utterly hijacked by primal terror. They were prey trapped in a dying cage, and they acted exactly like it, abandoning every shred of galactic civilization for a desperate grasp at a few more breaths. Inside the command center, the elite security forces fared no better. The heavily armed guards stood completely paralyzed, their high-tech weapons trembling in their hands as they looked toward Headmaster Vok for orders that never came. Callum Blanco did not panic. His pulse quickened, but his mind rapidly expanded, sharpening with the massive adrenaline surge of a primate whose ancestors hunted apex predators in the bitter ice of a death world. He stepped forcefully past the frozen guards, his heavy boots striking the obsidian floor with hard, deliberate authority. He grabbed the central command microphone right out of the hands of a shaking communications officer. "Listen to me," Callum roared into the comms. His voice was not excessively loud, but it possessed the deep, resonant, undeniable gravity of a supreme predator asserting absolute dominance over a panicked pack. "Everyone stop moving. Stop breathing so fast, the air is finite, and panic consumes oxygen. Form a perimeter around the secondary ventilation shafts and sit down immediately. Anyone who runs dies first." The raw, commanding power of his tone cut straight through the hysteria. It was a brutal evolutionary override. The terrified aliens instinctively recognized the voice of a creature born to survive the apocalypse. And slowly, The chaotic stampede in the corridors ground to a trembling, whimpering halt. With temporary order established, Callum slammed his bare hands onto the primary engineering terminal, his fingers flying across the cracked glass interface as he manually attempted to reboot the orbital stabilizers. A glaring red error code violently blocked his access. He bypassed the initial firewall, digging deep into the station's core registry, and his eyes narrowed into furious slits. The manual override had not been frozen by the fungal network. It had been intentionally severed from the inside. Callum spun around, leveling a lethal glare at Headmaster Vok. The avian politician was quietly inching toward a private, heavily reinforced escape pod, hidden directly behind his command chair. "You locked it out," Callum growled, stepping right into Vok's path to block his escape. "The backup generators are fully functional. You deliberately disabled the manual routing. You are using this crisis to ensure the Kalen students die in the epicenter, permanently removing your political rivals, even if it means sacrificing half the station to make it look like a tragic accident." Vok hissed loudly, his dark feathers puffing up in defensive anger. But he did not deny a single word. He simply shoved past Callum with sudden, desperate strength and locked himself inside the escape pod vestibule, leaving the rest of the bridge crew to face their impending doom. Suddenly, a sharp, agonizing migraine pierced the minds of everyone left in the command center. It was a chaotic, fragmented telepathic broadcast, incredibly weak and desperate, emanating directly from the frozen cafeteria. It was the Kalen. The arrogant, untouchable bullies were now nothing more than fading, imprisoned cores of dying light. Stripped entirely of their superiority, they were crying out into the void, begging anyone to save them from the encroaching, terrifying darkness. The plea was pathetic, completely devoid of their former pride. Pure logic dictated they should be left to rot. Their death would free the station's power grid and solve a massive galactic headache. But human logic was a beautifully twisted thing. Callum turned away from the coward in the escape pod and looked directly at Lyra, his jaw set in stone. "We are not letting them die," Callum stated firmly. Lyra blinked rapidly, her brilliant mind racing to catch up with his madness. "Callum, they are biological heat sinks. They are actively draining the station's energy. If we do not cut them loose, we hit the asteroid belt in 35 minutes. Then we give them a bigger fire," Callum replied, a reckless, brilliant spark igniting in his dark eyes. He pulled up the station's medical manifest on the glowing terminal. "Lyra, the emergency medical bay stores capsaicin extract, specifically derived from Earth's Carolina Reaper peppers, used strictly as a severe neural stimulant for paralyzed mammalian species. I need you to synthesize a compound right now. Mix the highest possible concentration of that capsaicin with standard, highly corrosive industrial battery acid from the maintenance bay." Lyra gasped loudly, realizing the horrific, chaotic chemistry he was proposing. "You want to create an aggressive, hyper-exothermic chemical reaction, a localized biological fusion catalyst." "Exactly," Callum said, grabbing a heavy utility belt and a massive plasma torch from a paralyzed guard. "They want heat. We are going to give them the fires of hell." Armed with a pressurized, reinforced injection canister containing a highly volatile cocktail of liquid fire, Callum Blanco turned his back on the command deck and began his descent into the abyss. The evacuation alarms had long since died out, replaced by a suffocating, echoing silence that pressed heavily against the eardrums. In the dimly lit corridors, the terrified remnants of the student body were still desperately clawing their way toward the upper hangar decks, forming a frantic, hyperventilating tide of scales, feathers, and bioluminescent skin. Callum walked directly against this current. He moved with a heavy, unyielding momentum, his broad shoulders cutting through the panicked masses like the bow of an icebreaker ship navigating a frozen sea. The extraterrestrial scholars threw themselves out of his path, sensing a sudden, terrifying shift in his aura. He was no longer the invisible, compliant maintenance boy. He was an apex predator, moving deliberately toward a kill. As he pushed deeper into the lower sublevels, the ambient temperature plummeted with horrific speed. The walls were heavily caked in jagged layers of thick, white frost, and the air grew so dense, it felt like walking through a current of freezing water. But the bitter cold was not the only lethal barrier standing between him and the epicenter. The station's automated security drones, normally tasked with pacifying unruly crowds using non-lethal sonic disruptors, had been completely compromised by the rapidly spreading ice fungus. The intense, unnatural freeze had shattered their delicate thermal optics and corrupted their primary targeting arrays. Stripped of their ability to differentiate between a fleeing student and an active threat, the hovering machines had defaulted to a blind, highly aggressive elimination protocol. They formed a deadly, floating barricade across the main arterial hallway, leading to the cafeteria. Their dual-mounted laser cannons spun up with a terrifying, high-pitched whine, actively sweeping the frozen corridor with searing bolts of concentrated, superheated light. They fired wildly at falling ice, shifting shadows, and completely empty space, turning the narrow passage into a lethal grid of crisscrossing energy beams that vaporized the frost upon impact. The atmospheric readouts on Callum's wrist console flashed a severe warning as the ambient temperature officially dropped past minus 100 degrees Celsius. At this extreme thermal deficit, the surrounding alien corpses lay perfectly preserved along the walls, their internal organs having ruptured instantly from the systemic shock. Any standard biological entity on the orbital station would have experienced immediate, catastrophic cellular death. Instead, the human body executed a miraculous, violent chemical rebellion. Callum's adrenal glands opened up completely, flooding his bloodstream with massive, concentrated doses of epinephrine. His heart rate spiked dramatically, transforming his chest into a roaring biological furnace that aggressively pumped super-oxygenated, boiling blood to his extremities. His pupils dilated rapidly, pulling in every single photon of ambient light available in the darkened corridor. The agonizing, biting pain of the extreme cold was completely suppressed by the raw, chemical euphoria of human survival instinct. He did not freeze. He accelerated. He gripped a heavy, solid tungsten wrench in his right hand, the cold metal biting into his thick, leatherwork glove. Taking a deep, ragged breath that scorched his lungs, Callum sprinted directly into the kill zone. A searing bolt of red laser fire tore through the space where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier, singeing the tips of his dark hair. Callum dropped his shoulder, sliding across the frictionless, ice-coated floor with the fluid, calculated grace of a species that had spent millennia hunting on frozen tundra. He sprang upward, off a reinforced bulkhead, defying the heavy artificial gravity, and brought the heavy tungsten wrench crashing down onto the sensory dome of the nearest drone. The machine's advanced composite armor crumpled instantly under the sheer, brutal kinetic force of human muscle density. Sparks showered over the ice as the drone crashed to the ground in a heap of mangled, sparking metal. Two more drones pivoted sharply in unison, their targeting lasers locking directly onto his chest. Callum did not retreat. He utilized the incredible stamina that defined primate evolution, pushing his physical body well past the threshold of exhaustion. He threw himself into a violent forward roll, dodging a heavy volley of plasma bolts that melted the icy floor behind him into pools of boiling water. Coming up on one knee, he hurled the heavy wrench with terrifying, lethal accuracy. The heavy tool spun through the freezing air and smashed cleanly through the primary rotor of the left drone, sending it spinning wildly out of control into the wall, where it detonated in a bright ball of blue electrical fire. Without missing a single beat, Callum closed the distance to the final machine. He grabbed its red-hot weapon barrel with his bare left hand, completely ignoring the blistering burn searing into his palm, and violently ripped the central processing core straight out of its chassis with a guttural roar of sheer exertion. The hallway fell deadly silent, save for the heavy, rhythmic panting of the human standing amidst the smoking wreckage. Sweat beaded on his forehead, flash freezing into tiny crystals of ice, but his internal furnace burned brighter than ever. He retrieved his heavy wrench, his breathing steadying, and kicked open the heavily frosted doors to the main cafeteria. The epicenter was a tomb of absolute zero. The luminescent ice fungus had completely overrun the massive room, weaving a glowing, parasitic web across the ceiling and walls that pulsed with stolen energy. At the absolute center of this frozen hellscape lay the Kalen clique. The once towering, arrogant energy beings were now reduced to small, dim, violently shivering clusters of fractured crystal. The deep, blinding ultraviolet light that used to radiate from their chests had faded to a pathetic, dying ember. They were barely clinging to consciousness, their shattered bodies serving as the anchor point for the parasitic thermal drain. Callum walked slowly toward them, his heavy boots crunching loudly over the frozen remnants of shattered tables and chairs. He knelt beside the Kalen leader, withdrawing the pressurized canister of extremely concentrated capsaicin and corrosive battery acid. The crystalline entity flickered weakly. A faint, broken telepathic whisper pushed its way into Callum's mind, trembling with agonizing pain and utter bewilderment. "Why?" the Kalen leader projected, his internal voice stripped entirely of its former superiority. "We preyed upon your kind. We degraded your existence. You are a lesser organism. Why would you walk through death to save the one who tormented you?" Callum stared down into the dying, faceted face of the alien bully. He did not show a single ounce of pity, nor did he offer a warm smile of forgiveness. His expression was as hard and unforgiving as the frozen steel surrounding them. He forcefully jammed the thick, reinforced injection needle directly into the primary energy valve on the alien's fractured chest plate. "Because on Earth, we do not let stray dogs freeze to death outside our doors," Callum replied coldly, his voice echoing with the crushing weight of a species that had conquered its own savage nature. "Even if they chew on our shoes." The raw, unfiltered truth of the statement hit the Kalen leader harder than any physical blow. In that single, frozen moment, the alien's entire worldview, built upon thousands of years of genetic arrogance and assumed superiority, completely and utterly shattered. Callum depressed the heavy plunger of the pressurized canister, forcing the volatile cocktail of highly concentrated earth, capsaicin, and industrial battery acid directly into the dying energy matrix of the Kalen leader. For exactly 1 second, absolutely nothing happened. The frozen silence of the cafeteria remained unbroken, heavy with the expectation of death. Then, the brutal, unyielding laws of human chemistry violently asserted their dominance. A localized, hyperexothermic rebound reaction detonated within the alien's chest. The corrosive acid violently stripped away the calcified frost, while the absurdly high concentration of pepper extract acted as a ruthless biological catalyst, hyperstimulating the Kalen's dormant plasma core, the parasitic ice fungus, which had been draining the station of its heat, suddenly found itself force-fed the thermal equivalent of a dying star. It could not adapt. The sprawling, luminescent blue network of frozen roots shrieked, instantly combusting into a brilliant, blinding wave of emerald and gold fire. This flame consumed the frost with terrifying speed, yet it emitted absolutely no toxic smoke, safely incinerating the plague. The Kalen leader's chest erupted with a renewed, blinding ultraviolet radiance, his body rapidly transforming from a frozen husk into a hypercharged, living microreactor. The entire Zenith Academy groaned around them as the massive bulkhead strained against the gravitational pull of the Tartarus debris field. Screeching metal echoed through the floorboards. They were drifting too fast. The station had precisely 2 minutes before its outer hull would be violently shredded by the asteroid belt. Callum did not hesitate to do the unthinkable. He stood up and reached his bare hands into the shattered ceiling panels above him, wrapping his raw, unprotected fingers tightly around the thick, exposed copper wiring of the station's primary transit cables. The sheer electrical resistance burned his skin instantly, but human adrenaline pushed the pain into the back of his mind. With a deafening roar of pure, primal exertion, he tore the heavy cables downward. He stepped directly over the radiant Kalen leader and plunged the exposed, sparking ends of the cables straight into the alien's glowing chest cavity. He made himself the living conduit. A massive, terrifying surge of raw voltage screamed through the Kalen's superheated core, violently leaping into the heavy cables held by the human. The catastrophic current blasted through Callum's insulated boots and surged directly into the station's dormant power grid. Deep within the mechanical bowels of the Zenith Academy, the massive orbital stabilizers roared back to life. The engines ignited with a thunderous boom that shook the very foundations of the space station, violently ripping the structure out of the deadly gravitational drift just 2 minutes before the impending impact. Instantly, the suffocating darkness broke. Brilliant, warm golden light flooded the expansive cafeteria and every corridor of the station. The heavy, localized blizzard vanished in a matter of seconds, the ice melting rapidly into harmless pools of warm water. Across the station, every surviving student and security officer stared in stunned silence at the emergency broadcast monitors, watching the live security feed from the cafeteria. They watched as Callum Blanco finally released the heavy power cables. He collapsed onto his knees, his broad chest heaving as he gasped for air. His hands were severely blistered, blackened, and smoking from the intense thermal and electrical friction. Despite the agonizing pain, a fierce, incredibly proud smile stretched across his face. The Kalen clique, now fully thawed and pulsing with renewed, vibrant energy, did not rise to attack him. The towering entities, who had spent their entire lives enforcing a reign of brutal superiority, looked down at their own glowing hands, and then at the exhausted human panting on the floor. The towering leader slowly sank to his knees in the puddles of melted ice. He pressed his glowing forehead directly against the wet floorboards, right at Callum's heavy boots. He began to weep violently, his broad shoulders shaking as he broadcasted waves of overwhelming, agonizing remorse and absolute gratitude. The rest of the clique immediately followed, kneeling in total submission to the fragile, flesh and blood creature who had dragged them back from the abyss. But the universe was not finished yielding to humanity. As Callum's blistered hands had gripped the primary transit cables, his human blood had smeared deeply into the crystalline data ports. That single, microscopic trace of DNA, supercharged by the massive electrical surge, bypassed every modern firewall on the station. It sank deep into the bedrock of the Zenith Academy, reaching a digital layer buried long before the current alien empires had even discovered space travel. A sudden, incredibly deep harmonic frequency hummed through the walls. The standard blue holographic interfaces across the entire academy flickered violently and shifted to a warm, glowing amber. A majestic, ancient voice, speaking in flawless, unaccented Earth English, echoed from the walls. Genetic marker confirmed. Terrestrial genome identified. Biometric sequence verified. Welcome back. Founders. Override protocol Omega engaged. Supreme command transferred. The entire station froze in absolute shock. The Zenith Academy, the crown jewel of intergalactic architecture, had not been built by the current ruling council. It had been constructed millions of years ago by an ancient, hyper-advanced iteration of humanity, left behind as a silent monument before they retreated to their death world. The system recognized Callum not as a maintenance worker, but as the rightful heir to the entire installation. Sitting on the floor, Callum looked at his glowing amber wrist console. He tapped a single button with a blistered finger. "System!" Callum rasped, his voice echoing out of every speaker on the station. Access the headmaster's encrypted personal logs. Broadcast the last 60 minutes. Immediately. Headmaster Vok's secret audio files played for the entire academy to hear. Every student, every teacher, and every security guard listened in horrified silence as the avian politician coldly outlined his plan to lock out the manual overrides, intentionally allowing the Kalen students to freeze to death to eliminate his political rivals, perfectly willing to sacrifice half the station in the process. Up on the command deck, Vok hammered frantically against the glass of his escape pod, screaming for it to launch. The amber lights flashed. His access was entirely denied by the founder override. The heavy security forces, their eyes burning with betrayal, did not hesitate. They manually breached the pod, dragged the screaming headmaster out by his pristine robes, and slammed heavy magnetic cuffs onto his wrists, stripping him of all authority in a matter of seconds. By the time the artificial sun rose over the Zenith Academy the next morning, the Galactic Council had quietly and very hastily updated their universal threat registries. Humanity was no longer listed at Tier 9. They were not even listed at Tier 4. The human race had been entirely removed from the standard scale and placed into a brand new, highly restricted classification. They were now labeled as an architect entity. The official description simply read, "Absolute danger. Impossible survival mechanics." However, they possess a terrifying capacity for altruism that exists entirely beyond our logical comprehension. Do not provoke. In the back corner of the grand, brightly lit cafeteria, the air was warm and deeply comforting. Callum sat quietly at a rebuilt table, his hands heavily wrapped in thick, white medical bandages. Beside him sat Lyra, carefully opening a brand new, quantum alloy lunchbox she had just received from Earth. The dining hall was packed with over 200 different alien species. Yet, as Callum and Lyra sat eating their lunch, an unprecedented phenomenon occurred. The apex predators, the glowing energy beings, and the towering warlords of the galaxy did not glare, mock, or assert their dominance. As the two humans ate their simple meal, the entire room unconsciously gave them a massive, wide berth. Whenever a student walked past their table, regardless of their species or social standing, they instinctively lowered their eyes, bowed their heads slightly, and moved with profound, silent reverence. The universe had finally learned its lesson, and humanity enjoyed its lunch in absolute, unquestioned peace. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's story entertaining and want to help keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can scan the donation QR code right here on the screen, or click the donation link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support allows our team to pay their bills, feed their families, and keep writing these incredible adventures for you. Thank you, and see you in the next story.